For lo, the fall of ocean's wall, space mocked and time outrun, and round the world the thought of all is as the thought of one. With the rise of the telegraph in the 1830s, dominating communication on land, this left the ocean as the next great communicative barrier. Some attempted to simply shorten the distance between Atlantic telegraph stations, but one chose to close the gap altogether. Cyrus Field worked through failure after failure, until finally managing to connect America to Europe by means of the first transatlantic submarine cable. These advancements not only improved communication across the Atlantic, but also had economic impacts, reducing information frictions and improving trade. While the technology has advanced over time, underwater cables like this one are still in heavy use even today. The journey of the first transatlantic cable, bridging the communicative gap between continents. This journey began with a problem which had existed since the beginning of time. As put by Daniel Zittraum, prior to the telegraph, messages could travel only as fast as the people who were conveying them. Whether on foot or on horseback, by train or by boat, each of these means of transporting information has its limitations. While some were quicker than others, they all took considerable amounts of time and effort to get messages from point A to point B. Although advancements had been made, messages from America to Britain were still transported by boat, usually taking around 2 weeks to deliver. The Battle of New Orleans, which took place in 1814, is an example of this slow-moving information. A peace treaty ending the War of 1812, called the Treaty of Ghent, was signed in Belgium on December 24, 1814. But American troops didn't hear about the treaty until about 2 months later, resulting in a completely unnecessary battle. But in the 1830s, this all began to change with the invention of one of the first instant messaging systems, the telegraph. Originally, America's closest telegraph station to Europe was in Nova Scotia, but people like the Roman Catholic Bishop of Newfoundland, J.T. Mullock, suggested connecting the U.S. cable to St. John's, Newfoundland. In the words of Mullock himself, by establishing it as the American telegraphic station, news could be communicated to the whole American continent, 48 hours, at least, sooner by any other route. A man named Frederick Gisborne took on this challenge, but after laying only a few miles of cable, he lost funding. As a result, he headed to New York in search of further capital. Cyrus Field was a successful businessman who had the funds to support Gisborne's venture. While considering the idea, Field realized that in finishing this line across Newfoundland, they would be laying the groundwork for a future transatlantic cable.
The idea that you could run a cable between England and America just seemed too fanciful. 2,000 odd miles it would need to cover, and it was regarded as science fiction, if you like.
Regardless of what many thought, Field wrote to Samuel Morse and Matthew Maury, who was the head of America's Naval Observatory at the time, and they both believed that a transatlantic cable was possible. It was during this time that Maury revealed the Telegraph Plateau's discovery, which was a 1,600-mile-long piece of flat ground along the ocean bed. This further convinced Field to take on the challenge. First, Field completed Gisborne's original telegraph, and while it was no easy task, he succeeded in connecting St. John's to America's telegraph line. Next, the Atlantic Telegraph Company was formed, and they estimated that $1.75 million would need to be raised for this venture. Field found support from Britain in the form of both funding and ships, in exchange for having priority over all other messages along the cable. In America, a similar deal was made, but it faced large amounts of opposition. This was a combination of disdain towards the Industrial Revolution, a failure to see the cable's necessity, and the dislike of being involved with Britain. Senator James C. Jones of Tennessee even went as far as to say that he didn't want anything to do with England or Englishmen. Despite this opposition, the Atlantic Cable Act passed in the Senate, garnering a single vote majority. With a combination of support from both America and Britain, as well as many individual investors, the Atlantic Cable Company was able to raise enough funds for this monumental project. On August 8, 1857, the Niagara and the Agamemnon set sail from Valentia, Ireland, towards Heart's Content, Newfoundland, to lay the first transatlantic cable. With around 2,500 nautical miles of cable dispersed between the two ships, they set off relaying messages back and forth with Valentia as they went. All went according to plan until the cable stopped working. They managed to regain connection, but not long after, they were hit by a wave and the cable sank to the bottom of the ocean. Next June, they tried again, this time starting at a rendezvous point in the middle, but like the first attempt, the cable again snapped. On July 17th of the same year, the project was quickly resumed and the vessels went out once more. Many were skeptical of its possibility for success, seeing what had happened previously. But nonetheless, they had come too far to turn back now. Shortly after leaving the rendezvous point, the connection along the cable stopped, while the cause remained undiscovered. This was only temporary, and the connection once more returned. With a renewal of transmission between the two vessels, they set forth once more. The cable was finally completed on August 5th, 1858. Field was heralded as a hero. Celebrations rang out on both sides of the Atlantic. But success only lasted so long, and about a month later, the cable went quiet. The Transatlantic Telegraph Company was left grappling for any way to fix it, even raising funds for another cable, but it was to no avail. Some saw this cable as unnecessary and too expensive for its unsatisfactory results, saying things like, 10 days bring us the mails from Europe. What need is there for the scraps of news in 10 minutes? Others began putting forth accusations that this is all merely an elaborate scheme and a hoax to get the money of unsuspecting investors. The public wanted and needed to know the truth. As a result of the confusion, a group known as a Committee of Inquiry was formed to investigate all that had happened and what had gone wrong. This was the first of these committees, and its precedents would go on to be used in other landmark scientific disasters, such as the sinking of the Titanic or the failure of the Challenger space shuttle. This committee placed the blame for the cable's failure mainly on Field's haste and the chief electrician's faulty cable design. They made suggestions for the cable's construction that quite possibly allowed for its eventual completion, but the same month that these findings were presented, the Civil War began, and the project of the transatlantic cable faded into the background. Field and the Atlantic Telegraph Company worked throughout the war to gain funds and create a better cable for the next attempt so that following the war, they would be ready. In 1865, the Great Eastern, the largest ship in the world, set out with the cable on board. But once again, it snapped and fell to the bottom of the ocean. They spent days trying to retrieve it through various grappling methods, but their attempts were unsuccessful. Field promptly began preparations for yet another attempt. Having the right ship, cable, and funding, they set out once more. Starting from Valentia, Ireland, and traveling to Heart's Content, Newfoundland, the Great Eastern made the journey which would mark the transatlantic cable's success down in history.
It took Cyrus Field 12 years to complete the project, and he had to cross the Atlantic 64 times. The cost was 8 times what he had originally estimated, but it paid off for him. He became a rich man.
As some of the first messages sent along the transatlantic cable, the Queen and President exchanged words of encouragement to mark the occasion. Queen Victoria expressed her congratulations to the United States and described how she hoped the cable would strengthen their bond, to which Andrew Johnson responded acknowledging her message and agreeing with its sentiments. As word of the cable's completion reached the people, large celebrations occurred, and they had good reason for their elation. The transatlantic cable itself actually improved economic relations.
And that's something that I also saw in my study, that better information reduced the risk and therefore brought the two countries closer to each other in terms of prices.
Another big impact of this cable would be that communications, which otherwise would have taken around 2 weeks to reach Britain, could now arrive in little to no time at all. Humanity was able to communicate like never before in history. Following what would go on to be known by some as the greatest enterprise ever undertaken by man, more underwater cables were laid. An example would be the Pacific Cable, which was completed in 1902 by the commercial Pacific Cable Company. Through the years, those cables have improved, leading to even more communicative advancements, like transatlantic telephone cables. For example, by 2022, Google plans to lay a cable from New York to the UK and Spain. Today, contrary to what many would assume, 95% of information conveyed across the Atlantic is transmitted by submarine cable. A technology developed over 100 years ago is still the primary form of transatlantic communication, even today. And with the development of a literal and figurative connection between Britain and the US, relations have been further cemented in their solidarity.